Today we're beginning to talk about the civil rights movement, or to be more specific, the modern civil rights movement, because there's this concept that the civil rights movement didn't really start until like the 1950s, when in fact the civil rights movement overall in the United States began pretty much as soon as the United States was founded. So this goes all the way back to before the Civil War, with trying to fight for the end of slavery, and moving into getting civil or individual rights protected for African Americans, which is what we're going to be talking about here in the 1950s, and it still continues on into the 60s, 70s, and even to today in the 2000s. All right, so there's a lot of terms to get down. Some of these you know already, hopefully, particularly the people. Others we're going to go over in this lesson, so there's not a whole lot I'm going to explain on that screen. So again, 2 minutes, don't pause the video, start writing, and then you can continue writing as I begin explaining. All right, so where we're going to start here is the misnomer or the misinformation that segregation was only limited to one particular region of the United States. There was segregation all over the United States. It wasn't just in the South, but there's two different versions of it. So the one that is fairly, I don't want to say self-explanatory, but is obvious, is what happened in the South, which was with Jim Crow laws, which were based off of the black codes from places like Louisiana, as well as what existed from colonial times when slaves were first forced over into the Americas. So that is segregation by law. So our de jure or de jure segregation. Now, the one that was trickier and that most other states dealt with was segregation by custom or de facto segregation. That's what it should be. Anyway, what the key thing here is like, so one is by law. So that's what the Jim Crow laws were. States passed laws saying limiting what African Americans could do, what jobs they could be in, what areas of town they could go in and live in, what areas of public buildings they were allowed to go in. When it was done by custom, though, it's a little sneakier. It's not so much surface. It's not out in the open like Jim Crow laws were. So in the northern, Midwestern, and Western states, they did this. They still were segregated, but there wasn't any law that said that they needed to be segregated. So what this meant was, the way that you could see it is that African Americans would be forced into particular neighborhoods. Now, sometimes that was by choice. Other times, though, is that if that you had a family that didn't necessarily was the same economically, they could not move into a I don't want to say not, a higher income neighborhood. They were just expected, and they were denied all housing except for in wherever African Americans were in that city. Same went with jobs, is that while there wasn't anything on state law that said that certain employers couldn't hire African Americans, most employers stayed away from that. Same with schools. There wasn't anything in the laws that said that African Americans had to go to these particular schools, but most schools would not admit African Americans to their schools, keeping them white. That's what we mean by custom, is that no one's telling anybody to do this, but they still do it anyway. Nobody's telling white Americans to do this, they just do it. So this is the environment that the United States is in. This is the environment that our veterans coming back from fighting a war over in Europe and in Asia, fighting for the rights and liberties of Asians and Europeans, they come home and they realize, or they are reminded yet again, that they do not have the same liberties as everybody else does in the United States. They don't have the same rights and liberties that the people that they fought for in other foreign countries have. So, some of the small things that begin building this up, which is, we just take a moment here to talk about Gandhi, who was an Indian politician over in the country of India, and he led a successful nonviolent protest campaign to liberate India from Great Britain. So this is on a monumental scale. Most revolutions, most rebellions involve fighting, involve the group trying to liberate themselves against the establishment, and they usually end up taking up arms and they fight each other. India did not go that route. Gandhi was able to lead hundreds of thousands, millions of people in nonviolent protest, whether that be hunger strikes, marches, sit-ins, all these different methods that don't involve violence. And they actually got India its independence from Great Britain. It's a massive, massive undertaking, and was something that the world had never seen, at least in recorded history. So that's going to have a huge influence on people who are wanting to either guarantee their liberties or liberate themselves after that. That took place, I'm going to get the timeline wrong, so I don't want to go specific here, but that took place after World War II, but before our modern civil rights movement really kicks off. Then you have early successes, like something might seem small, but it was a big deal back then. Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball. This is big because, not so much today, but back then, baseball was the major sport in the United States, a major form of entertainment. So where you didn't have a whole lot of African American representation in, say, television and movies for the most part, other than small roles, here you have an individual, an African American is put onto a major league team and not only participates, but does very well. So wins multiple awards in his first year, eventually leads that team into a championship, so does everything that you would, and essentially becomes a superstar. And opens the door for a huge number of African Americans to enter into major league sports, not just baseball itself. And then you have Brown versus Board of Education. We shorten it to Brown versus Board. And this was a Supreme Court decision that what it did was end segregation throughout the country. So whether it's by law or by custom. And that is a huge deal. Now, the primary focus was in education, But the Supreme Court decided that they weren't just going to apply it to education, they were going to apply it to every aspect in which segregation was applied. So now, and this is going to create a firestorm, particularly in southern states, but also in many other places as well, where people weren't willing to share public spaces and educational spaces with African Americans. All right, moving on. So again, you got 2 minutes. Don't pause the video. Write down what you can. If you don't get it in the 2 minutes, continue writing when I begin explaining. Picking up where we just left off. So you're going to have a lot of places that are not fond of this idea of that sharing public spaces with African Americans. The first pushback that we really see in a large scale happens in Arkansas, in Little Rock, where when they attempt to integrate a high school, the governor of Arkansas orders the National Guard of Arkansas to stop 9 African American students from entering the school. This is a huge deal. So essentially the governor is using the military to prevent segregation, which has been decided by the Supreme Court, which is now federal law, which means it's the law for every state. No state can opt out of that. So, in response to that, President Eisenhower orders that should be the 101st, not the 10th, the 101st Airborne Army Division to escort the students in. So in this case, the governor of Arkansas says, well, I'm going to take what troops I have available to me and I'm going to stop them. And then President Eisenhower says, well, I have the entire American Army at my disposal, so I'm going to send in one division that's going to make sure those kids get into school and that federal law is followed. And again, this could have been an issue that sparked something larger, but when the governor of Arkansas realized the extent that President Eisenhower was willing to go to, he backs down. In addition, the President of the United States also can gain control of National Guard units. And that's the other thing President Eisenhower did, was that he took control of the Arkansas National Guard and told them to get out of there. And he made sure that U.S. Army divisions escorted those kids in. So when the federal government starts seeing this, they start seeing that southern states and other areas of the country may not follow Brown versus Board of Education's decision, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The main importance of this law is that it creates a commission that is going to review any different cases, any laws on the state level, and determine whether they're violating the Constitution by violating somebody's civil rights, specifically African Americans. So a lot of voting laws are going to be targeted for this. A lot of transportation issues are going to be targeted by this commission. Now, it's a commission, meaning it's a group of people who are going to review something and then offer up legislative ideas or offer up ideas for laws that can fix these things. They don't have power to arrest anybody. They don't have power to actually write and pass a law themselves. So it's a huge change, but it's a change that is going to create gradual change. It's not going to make things happen overnight. So also around this time, within these few years, you also have another monumental event in the Montgomery bus boycott. And this is important for two reasons. One is the actual boycott itself, and the other one is who emerges out of this boycott. But before we jump into it, just as a reminder, going back to Louisiana history, the Montgomery bus boycott was not just some random occurrence. This was a planned event. And the people who organized this, among them Martin Luther King Jr., looked to a Baton Rouge transportation boycott that happened in the 40s, if I'm correct. Don't quote me on that. It's been a while since I've taught that lesson. But in Baton Rouge, people carpooled together. People made sure to help out one another to get where they needed to go instead of taking public transportation, which was segregated, meaning African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus or the back of the train car, and if the train car was pretty full, they'd have to stand up to give a white person a seat. So they took a lot of the ideas that happened in the Baton Rouge boycott and they adapted them for Montgomery. And one of the things that sparked this off was a young girl by the name of Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat on a bus, and she was arrested. Now, when we talk about it being planned, at this point, they could have rallied around Claudette Colvin and made her the focal point of this. But the organizers thought, with Claudette Colvin being so young, and there were a couple of other issues that they didn't want to shine too much of a public light on, they were that wasn't the moment to move. So then that brings in Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is presented generally as just this nice woman who was strong enough not to give up her seat. That is true, but there's another side to Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist. She had worked with the NAACP. She knew these strategies, she knew these methods that were being adopted by African Americans in their fight for civil rights about nonviolent protests, many of which they got from Gandhi and from other people who advocated for nonviolence. So Rosa Parks was not just randomly there. This was a moment in time which they were trying to get things done, and they picked somebody like Rosa Parks because she was knowledgeable enough about the law, about tactics, to make sure that they were able to get something like this started without causing much of a disturbance. Same thing goes all the way back to Plessy versus Ferguson here in New Orleans. Homer Plessy was an African American man, but was what we would call passable, was that he looked white to a lot of people. And they put him on a train car to try and end segregation on train cars back in the late 1800s. That kind of backfired on them. But again, it was a strategy used by civil rights groups back then, same as with the Montgomery bus boycott. So Rosa Parks gets arrested for not giving up her seat. And then the different coalitions of African American groups that are fighting for civil rights get together in Montgomery and they plan this bus boycott based on strategies used from Baton Rouge, based on nonviolent methods of protest that they've gotten from Gandhi and other nonviolence advocates. and they are successful. Now, it takes a couple of years, but they finally do not only get Alabama to change their law, but they do get it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where it ends segregation on public transportation, which was not, they had to clarify that because many people were trying to get around it from Brown versus Board. The last point about the Montgomery bus boycott is that this is when the nation gets introduced to the young minister Martin Luther King Jr. And so with Montgomery, as well as an arrest for a nonviolent protest in Birmingham, and a letter that Martin Luther King writes to the press during his stay in captivity, Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the superstar of the civil rights movement. Now, he's not the only leader. There were many, many others that did many, many different things, but he becomes the superstar as of the Montgomery bus boycott, and we'll leave it there.